Captain James Jimmy Sullivan here. 28 years running commercial fishing vessels out of Gloucester, Massachusetts. I've weathered nor'easters that turned the North Atlantic into a graveyard, brought crews home from equipment failures that should have killed us all, and made the hard decisions that separate captains from deckhands. But nothing in those 28 years prepared me for what happened aboard the F/V Relentless on November 12, 2023. A routine scallop trip that became a nightmare when our winch cable snapped under load, trapping my newest crew member underwater in a tangle of steel wire and crushing him against our hull. I had 30 seconds to make a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Cut the foul gear loose and let Marcus Washington die quickly in the freezing North Atlantic, or risk losing my entire crew of 6 men trying to save one who was probably already dead. I gave the order to cut the line. The decision saved 5 lives and cost 1. But 3 months later, I still wake up at 3 a.m. hearing Marcus screaming for help that never came, still see his eyes looking up at me through 20 feet of black water as I made the call that sealed his fate. This is the story of the worst decision I ever made, and why it was also the only decision I could make. November in the North Atlantic is when the ocean reminds you who's really in charge. The F/V Relentless pushed through 6-foot swells 60 miles southeast of Gloucester, her diesel thrumming steady as we worked the scallop beds that had been good to my family for 3 generations. The Relentless was my grandfather's boat, originally 62 feet of Nova Scotia steel built to handle the worst weather the Atlantic could throw at her. My father had modernized her electronics and safety systems, and I'd spent the last 15 years upgrading everything else. Twin 425 horsepower Caterpillars, state-of-the-art fish finders, hydraulic systems that could haul 10,000 pounds of scallop dredges through anything short of a hurricane. But the most important upgrade wasn't mechanical. It was the crew I'd assembled over the years. Men who knew their jobs, trusted each other, and understood that survival in these waters depended on everyone doing their part without hesitation. My core crew that November included Tommy Hendricks, my engineer and first mate for the past 12 years. Tommy was 45, steady as a rock, the kind of man who could diagnose engine trouble by listening to vibrations most people couldn't even feel. Bobby Chin was our youngest regular at 26, third-generation fisherman whose grandfather had taught him to read weather patterns like most kids read comic books. Then there was Frank Morrison, our senior deckhand, and his younger brother Dave, who'd been working my boat for 8 seasons between them. The Morrison brothers knew scallop fishing like most people know their own neighborhoods. Every trick, every shortcut, every danger that came with dragging heavy gear across the ocean floor. And finally there was Marcus Washington. Marcus was new to my crew, hired just 6 weeks earlier when my regular deckhand took a shore job with better hours and health insurance. 28 years old, built like a linebacker, with hands that showed he wasn't afraid of hard work. He'd grown up in New Bedford, working factory ships and smaller boats, but the Relentless was his first time working Georges Bank scallops. What I liked about Marcus was his attitude. He asked questions instead of pretending he knew things he didn't. He showed up early, stayed late, and treated the dangerous work with the respect it deserved. In 6 weeks, he'd proven himself reliable under pressure and quick to learn the specialized skills that scallop fishing required. What I didn't know about Marcus was that he was supporting not just himself, but his mother and 2 younger sisters back in New Bedford. His father had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, leaving the family with medical bills and a mortgage they couldn't afford on his mother's income alone. Marcus had taken the job on the Relentless because it paid better than anything else he could find, even though he'd never worked boats this far offshore before. That November morning, we were having the kind of trip that makes the dangerous work worthwhile. The scallop beds were producing good catches, our dredges coming up heavy with large market-sized scallops that would bring top dollar at the dock. We'd filled about 60% of our hold in 2 days, and the weather forecast looked stable enough to work for another day before heading home. Marcus was learning to operate the winch systems that raised and lowered our dredges, working under Frank Morrison's supervision. It was skilled work that required precise timing and constant attention to the loads being handled. A mistake could damage expensive gear, waste valuable fishing time, or in the worst case, seriously injure someone. Key thing to remember, Frank was explaining as Marcus operated the starboard winch, is that this cable's under maybe 8,000 pounds of tension when we're hauling gear off the bottom. You lose control of that load, it'll take your head off or pull you overboard before you can blink. Marcus nodded, his hands steady on the controls as he brought the dredge slowly toward the surface. He was getting the feel for it, learning to read the cable tension and adjust his speed based on what the gear was encountering on the bottom. "How do you know when something's wrong?" Marcus asked. "Like if the dredge gets hung up or the cable's about to part?" "You feel it through the boat," Frank replied. Vibration changes, engine loads up different, cable sounds different when it's under stress. After a while, you don't even think about it, you just know. It was good advice from a man who'd been doing this work for 15 years without a serious accident. Frank had seen cables part, dredges lost, and men injured by equipment that demanded respect every minute of every day. But he'd never seen what was about to happen to the Relentless. Around 1,400 hours, we were setting our gear for what would be our final tow of the trip. The weather was holding steady, 15-knot winds, 6-foot seas, good visibility. Bobby had found a productive bottom area on the fish finder, and the first few sets had produced excellent catches. Marcus was on the starboard winch again, lowering the dredge under Frank's supervision while Tommy monitored the engine loads from the wheelhouse. It was routine work that we'd done hundreds of times before, with experienced crew and well-maintained equipment. But what none of us knew was that the starboard winch cable had developed a small fray about 50 feet from the dredge. A few strands of steel wire had been cut by contact with the dredge frame during previous hauls, weakening the cable just enough that it would fail under the combination of weight and shock loading that scallop fishing demanded. The cable parted just as Marcus was paying it out through the block, letting the dredge settle toward the bottom in 180 feet of water. The sudden release of tension should have been a relief. Normally, when a cable parts, the dangerous load simply disappears into the ocean. But this time, the cable didn't fall cleanly away from the boat. Instead, the parted end whipped back toward the Relentless with tremendous force, wrapping around Marcus's legs before he could move clear. The weight of the dredge, now free-falling toward the bottom, created a downward pull that no human being could resist. Marcus had maybe 2 seconds to register what was happening before the cable dragged him over the side and into the North Atlantic. By the time I reached the rail, he was 20 feet underwater, tangled in steel cable, being pulled deeper by 800 pounds of scallop dredge that was racing toward the bottom at terminal velocity. Frank was already throwing life rings and emergency gear, but we all knew that Marcus was beyond the reach of anything we could throw him. The cable had him trapped, the weight was pulling him down, and the water temperature was 42 degrees, cold enough to stop a man's heart in minutes even if he could somehow reach the surface. Emergency ascent. I shouted to Tommy. Get that winch reversed, try to bring him back up. But Tommy was already at the controls, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. Cables parted, Jimmy. There's nothing to winch up. The gear's in free fall and Marcus is going down with it. I looked over the side at the disturbed water where Marcus had disappeared, then at my crew, then at the GPS that showed we were 60 miles from the nearest Coast Guard station. Even if we called for help immediately, even if they dispatched a helicopter within minutes, Marcus would be dead long before rescue could arrive. There. Bobby suddenly shouted, pointing into the water. I can see him. 40 feet down, barely visible in the dark water, Marcus was fighting against the cable that held him. Somehow, impossibly, he was still alive, still struggling to free himself from the gear that was dragging him toward the bottom. And that's when I had to make the choice that would define the rest of my life. Marcus was still moving 40 feet below the surface, his bright orange survival suit creating a splash of color against the dark water as he fought against the cable wrapped around his legs. The scallop dredge was pulling him deeper with each passing second, but somehow he was still conscious, still fighting for his life. Jesus Christ, he's alive down there, Frank said, leaning over the rail. We gotta do something, Jimmy. My mind was racing through options, all of them bad. Marcus was trapped underwater by steel cable attached to an 800-pound dredge that was sinking toward 180 feet of bottom. Even if we could somehow get a line to him, even if he could somehow free himself from the cable, he'd been underwater for almost a minute in water cold enough to kill him in minutes. Tommy, kill the engines, I ordered. Frank, Dave, get the emergency diving gear. Bobby, get on the radio, Coast Guard emergency frequency. But even as I gave these orders, I knew they were futile. Our emergency diving equipment consisted of a few masks and snorkels. Nothing that would allow anyone to reach Marcus at that depth. The Coast Guard was hours away. And with each passing second, Marcus was being pulled deeper into water that would crush him long before hypothermia could kill him. Captain? Bobby's voice carried panic. I can still see him moving. He's trying to signal us. I looked down at Marcus, now 50 feet below the surface and sinking steadily. His movements were becoming more frantic as he realized the impossible situation he was in. The cable had wrapped around both legs, making it impossible for him to swim upward even if he could somehow hold his breath long enough to reach the surface. Frank was already suiting up in our cold water gear, preparing to go over the side despite the fact that it was essentially a suicide mission. At 50 feet and dropping, Marcus was beyond the reach of anyone without professional diving equipment and training. "Frank, no," I said firmly. "You go in there, I lose 2 men instead of 1. We can't just watch him drown, Jimmy. There's gotta be something." "There is," Dave Morrison interrupted, pointing to the emergency equipment locker. "The cutting torch. We could cut the cable, free him from the dredge weight." For a moment, hope flickered. If we could somehow cut the cable that was dragging Marcus down, he might be able to swim to the surface on his own. The underwater cutting torch was designed for exactly this kind of emergency, freeing fouled gear or cutting away damaged equipment. But then reality set in. Marcus was now 60 feet down and still sinking. Even if we could get the cutting torch operational, even if someone could dive deep enough to reach the cable, even if we could cut him free, he'd been underwater for nearly 2 minutes in freezing water. "Tommy," I called to my engineer. "How long to set up the cutting torch?" 10 minutes, maybe 15. "But Jimmy, he's at 60 feet and dropping. Even if we cut him loose, how's he gonna get back to the surface from that depth?" The answer was that he couldn't. At 70 feet underwater, even if Marcus could somehow be freed from the cable, he'd be too deep and too hypothermic to make it back to the surface on his own. We'd need professional divers, decompression equipment, medical support, none of which we had. "There!" Bobby shouted again. "He's still moving. He's looking up at us." I forced myself to look down at Marcus, now 75 feet below the surface. His movements were becoming weaker, more erratic, but he was still conscious, still aware of what was happening to him. And somehow, impossibly, he was looking up toward our boat, toward the men who were supposed to be his shipmates, his safety net, his guarantee that dangerous work wouldn't become a death sentence. That's when I saw something that made my blood freeze. The cable wasn't just wrapped around Marcus's legs. It was tangled with our anchor chain. When the winch cable had parted, it had somehow fouled our anchor chain on its way over the side. The weight of the sinking dredge was now pulling on our anchor, threatening to drag the entire Relentless down with it. "Tommy, check the anchor windlass," I ordered. "Tell me we're not being pulled down." Tommy disappeared forward to check our anchor situation while I tried to process the full scope of what was happening. Marcus was trapped underwater, dying slowly as the cold water and pressure overwhelmed him. But now our entire boat was at risk if the sinking dredge had enough weight and leverage to compromise our stability. "Jimmy?" Tommy's voice carried pure terror. "The anchor chain's under massive tension. Something's pulling us down by the bow. We're taking on water through the anchor well." I looked at the GPS display and confirmed what I already feared. The Relentless was being pulled forward and down by whatever was attached to our anchor chain. Water was coming over our bow with each wave, and our forward deck was starting to ride lower than it should. The situation had just escalated from 1 man in trouble to 6 men in mortal danger. "How much time do we have?" I asked Tommy. "If that chain doesn't break loose? Maybe 20 minutes before we lose buoyancy forward. Maybe less if the seas pick up." I looked down at Marcus one more time. He was now over 80 feet down, his movements barely visible, the bright orange of his survival suit fading into the dark water. Even if by some miracle we could reach him, even if we could somehow cut him free and bring him to the surface, he'd been underwater for nearly 3 minutes in water that would have stopped most men's hearts already. And now his tragedy was about to become our tragedy if I didn't make a decision that went against every instinct I had as a captain and as a human being. Frank Morrison was at my shoulder, following my gaze down into the water where Marcus was disappearing into the depths. "Jimmy," he said quietly, "you know what you gotta do." I did know. The fouled anchor chain had to be cut, immediately, before the weight of the sinking gear could compromise our stability. Cutting the chain would free the Relentless from whatever was pulling us down, but it would also abandon Marcus to his fate 80 feet underwater with no chance of rescue. "Get the bolt cutters," I said, the words feeling like glass in my throat. "Heavy-duty ones from the engine room." "Jimmy," Bobby protested. We can't save him," I said, cutting him off. "He's been underwater for 3 minutes in 40-degree water. Even if we could somehow get him to the surface, even if we had a trauma unit standing by, he's already gone." Dave Morrison was nodding grimly. "Captain's right. We lose that anchor chain to whatever's down there, we're all going to die." Tommy returned with the bolt cutters, heavy-duty tools designed to cut through steel in emergency situations. His hands were shaking as he handed them to me, understanding what cutting the anchor chain would mean for Marcus. "You want me to do it, Jimmy?" Tommy offered. "No," I said. "This is my boat, my crew, my responsibility. I'll make the cut." I took the bolt cutters forward to where our anchor chain entered the water, now under tremendous tension from whatever weight was pulling on it below. The chain was vibrating with stress, and I could feel the Relentless being pulled forward and down with each passing second. One cut through this chain would save my boat and my crew. It would also guarantee that Marcus Washington would die alone in the dark water of the North Atlantic, trapped in steel cable with no hope of rescue. "Jimmy?" Frank called from the stern. "I can't see him anymore. He's too deep." Marcus had disappeared into water too dark and too deep for us to track his descent. But cutting the anchor chain wouldn't just abandon him to his fate. It would ensure that his body would never be recovered, never return to his family for burial. I positioned the bolt cutters on the anchor chain, feeling the vibration of tremendous weight and stress through the steel links. One squeeze of these handles would free the Relentless and condemn Marcus to death in the deepest water. "All crews stand clear of the foredeck," I announced, cutting the anchor chain in 3, 2, 1. The bolt cutters bit through the steel chain with a sharp crack that I'll hear for the rest of my life. Immediately, the Relentless lurched upward as the massive weight was released. Our bow lifted out of the water, no longer being pulled down by whatever had fouled our anchor chain. The immediate danger to the boat and crew was over. But somewhere far below us, Marcus Washington was still sinking toward the bottom, still trapped in the cable and gear that I had just cut loose, still dying alone in the crushing darkness of the North Atlantic. "It's done," I said to my crew, though the words felt like a confession rather than a statement of fact. Frank Morrison put his hand on my shoulder. "You saved the boat, Jimmy. You saved all of us." But as I stood on the deck of the Relentless, looking down at the water that had swallowed Marcus and my anchor chain, all I could think about was the mother and 2 sisters in New Bedford who would never see him come home. And about the choice I'd made to save 5 lives by sacrificing one. The immediate aftermath of cutting the anchor chain was eerily quiet. Without the tremendous tension pulling our bow down, the Relentless rode normally again, rising and falling with the 6-foot swells like nothing had happened. But the water around our boat was disturbed, marked by bubbles and debris from whatever had just disappeared into the depths below us. "Tommy, damage report," I called out, trying to focus on immediate concerns rather than the reality of what I'd just done. "How's the anchor well?" "Taking on some water, but the pumps are handling it," Tommy replied. "Forward compartments are dry. We're stable." The practical side of my brain cataloged this information automatically. Boat secure, crew safe, no immediate mechanical problems. But the other part of my brain, the part that had to live with what had just happened, was struggling to process the fact that Marcus Washington was somewhere beneath us, dead or dying, while we went about the business of ensuring our own survival. "Frank, Dave, secure that area around the anchor well," I ordered. "Make sure we don't have any loose gear that could cause problems." The Morrison brothers moved forward to follow my orders, but I could see the shock in their movements, the way they avoided looking over the side where Marcus had disappeared. They were experienced fishermen who understood the dangers of our work, but watching a shipmate die was something none of us had experienced before. Bobby was still at the radio, his young face pale with disbelief. "Jimmy, should I call the Coast Guard? Report what happened?" It was a reasonable question that required an immediate answer, but I found myself hesitating. Once I made that radio call, once I reported Marcus's death to the authorities, there would be investigations, questions, official scrutiny of every decision I'd made in the past 10 minutes. "What's our position?" I asked instead. 43 degrees, 12 minutes north. 69 degrees, 41 minutes west. Bobby read from the GPS, bottom depth shows 187 feet. I looked at those numbers and realized they would be burned into my memory forever. The exact coordinates where Marcus Washington had died, where I'd made the decision to cut the anchor chain and abandon him to the ocean. "Make the call," I said finally. "Coast Guard emergency frequency. Report a crew member lost overboard, presumed drowned." As Bobby keyed the microphone and began transmitting our emergency report, I tried to prepare myself for the questions that were coming. The Coast Guard would want to know exactly what had happened, what rescue efforts we'd attempted, why we hadn't been able to save Marcus. And eventually they would ask about the decision to cut the anchor chain. "Coast Guard Boston, this is fishing vessel Relentless with a search and rescue emergency," Bobby transmitted. "We have lost one crew member overboard, presumed drowned. Request immediate assistance." The Coast Guard response was professional and immediate. "Fishing vessel Relentless, this is Coast Guard Boston. We copy your emergency report. What is your current position and the circumstances of your crew member going overboard?" Bobby looked at me for guidance. The official questions were starting, and every answer would become part of a permanent record that would be scrutinized by investigators, insurance companies, and lawyers. "Tell them the truth," I said. Winch cable parted, crew member got tangled in the gear, went over the side. Bobby transmitted our position and a basic description of the accident. The Coast Guard immediately began coordinating a search and rescue response, though both they and we knew that after 15 minutes in 40-degree water, Marcus had no chance of survival. Relentless, be advised we are launching a helicopter from Cape Cod and dispatching cutter forward to your position. Estimated time of arrival for helicopter is 45 minutes. Are you in immediate danger? Negative, Coast Guard, Bobby replied. Vessel is secure, remaining crew is safe. Frank Morrison appeared at my elbow as the radio conversation continued. Jimmy, what do we tell them about the anchor chain? About cutting loose whatever was pulling us down? It was the question I'd been dreading but knew was coming. The Coast Guard would want a complete account of everything that had happened, including my decision to cut the anchor chain while Marcus was still attached to whatever was pulling it down. We tell them the truth, I said. That our anchor fouled the broken cable, that we were being pulled down, that I made the decision to cut the chain to save the boat and crew. They're gonna ask if we could have saved him, Dave Morrison added quietly. If there was something else we could have done. And I'll tell them that Marcus was 80 feet underwater in 40-degree water, trapped in steel cable. That even if we'd had professional diving equipment, even if we'd had a trauma team standing by, he was already gone. But even as I said these words, I wondered if they were true. Had Marcus been dead already when I made the decision to cut the chain? Or had he still been alive, still fighting, still hoping that his shipmates would find a way to save him? The helicopter arrived 37 minutes later, a Coast Guard HH-60 Jayhawk that approached our position in a controlled hover while a rescue swimmer prepared to deploy. I could see the aircrew scanning the water around our boat, looking for any sign of Marcus even though we all knew the search was hopeless. Fishing vessel Relentless, this is Coast Guard 6031, came the helicopter pilot's voice over the radio. We're commencing search operations in your area. Can you provide last known position of your missing crew member? I took the microphone from Bobby. Coast Guard 6031, this is Captain Sullivan. Our crew member went over the side at this position, attached to approximately 800 pounds of fishing gear. He was underwater for several minutes before we lost visual contact. Copy that, Relentless. We're deploying our rescue swimmer to conduct an underwater search. What was the depth when he went over? 187 feet, I replied, knowing that the depth made underwater rescue impossible but needing to provide accurate information. The rescue swimmer deployed from the helicopter into the cold North Atlantic, disappearing beneath the surface in a search pattern around our boat. For 20 minutes, he dove repeatedly, each time surfacing empty-handed, each dive confirming what we already knew. Marcus Washington was gone. When the swimmer was finally recovered to the helicopter, the pilot's voice carried the finality we'd all been expecting. Relentless, we've completed our underwater search. No contact with your missing crew member. We're expanding the surface search, but given the water temperature and time elapsed, we're treating this as a recovery operation rather than rescue. The helicopter continued searching the area for another hour while the Coast Guard cutter forward steamed toward our position. But as the afternoon wore on, it became increasingly clear that Marcus's body would not be recovered. The weight of the scallop dredge had carried him to the bottom in water too deep for recovery operations. Relentless, this is cutter forward, came a new voice over the radio as the Coast Guard vessel appeared on our horizon. We'll be alongside in 15 minutes to conduct our investigation and take statements from your crew. This was the moment I'd been anticipating and dreading since cutting the anchor chain. Professional investigators who would want to know exactly what had happened, exactly what decisions I'd made, exactly why Marcus Washington was dead and the rest of us were alive. All crew, I announced over our intercom. Coast Guard's coming aboard to investigate. Tell them exactly what happened. No embellishment, no speculation. Just the facts. But as I watched the Coast Guard cutter approach, I wondered if the facts would be enough to explain why I'd made the choice to cut that anchor chain. Whether investigators who'd never commanded a fishing vessel in emergency conditions could understand the split-second decision to sacrifice one man to save five. Tommy appeared beside me as the Coast Guard vessel maneuvered alongside the Relentless. Jimmy, he said quietly, you made the right call. We'd all be dead if you hadn't cut that chain. Maybe, I replied. But Marcus is still dead because of a decision I made. Marcus was dead the moment that cable wrapped around his legs. What you did was save the rest of us. The Coast Guard investigators boarded my boat with professional efficiency, setting up their equipment and beginning the process of documenting exactly what had happened to Marcus Washington. As they worked, I tried to prepare myself for questions I wasn't sure I could answer. Questions about the seconds when I'd held the bolt cutters, knowing that cutting the chain would abandon Marcus to his fate. Questions about whether there had been any other option, any way to save both Marcus and the crew. Questions about how a captain lives with the knowledge that he chose who lived and who died. The investigation was about to begin, and with it, the official judgment of the worst decision I'd ever made. Coast Guard investigator Lieutenant Sarah Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of precise, methodical manner that suggested she'd seen her share of maritime accidents. She set up her recording equipment in the Relentless galley while her partner, Petty Officer Martinez, photographed the damaged winch equipment and interviewed my crew individually. "Captain Sullivan," Lieutenant Chen began, "I want you to walk me through exactly what happened, from the moment you noticed something was wrong until you made the decision to cut your anchor chain." I'd been rehearsing this conversation in my head for the past 2 hours, but sitting across from an official investigator made the weight of it real in a way that preparation couldn't address. Every word I said would become part of an official record that would determine whether Marcus's death was ruled an unavoidable accident or negligent homicide. "We were setting gear for our final tow of the trip," I began. Marcus Washington was operating the starboard winch under the supervision of Frank Morrison. The cable parted just as Marcus was paying out the dredge. What time did this occur? Approximately 1,430 hours. The cable failure was instantaneous, no warning, no visible damage beforehand. Lieutenant Chen made notes as I spoke, occasionally asking for clarification on technical details. Her questions were professional, focused on facts rather than emotions, but I could see her building a timeline that would either support or contradict my version of events. "When you realized Marcus was in the water, what was your immediate response?" "I ordered emergency ascent on the winch, but my engineer reported that the cable had parted completely. There was nothing to winch up. Marcus was being pulled down by the weight of the dredge." "How deep was he when you last had visual contact?" This was the question I'd been dreading. "Approximately 80 feet and still descending. He'd been underwater for nearly 3 minutes at that point." "Was he still moving? Still conscious?" I forced myself to remember those terrible moments when Marcus had been visible beneath the surface, fighting against the cable that held him. Yes, he was still struggling against the gear that had fouled around his legs. Lieutenant Chen's expression didn't change, but I saw her make a note that I suspected would be important later. Marcus had been alive and fighting when I made the decision to abandon him. "Tell me about the anchor chain situation," she continued. "When did you realize your vessel was in danger?" "My engineer reported that our anchor chain was under massive tension, that something was pulling us down by the bow. We were taking on water through the anchor well." "How much time did you estimate you had before your vessel's safety was compromised?" 20 minutes, maybe less. The Relentless was being pulled forward and down with each wave. If we hadn't cut the chain when we did, we would have lost buoyancy forward. Lieutenant Chen paused in her note-taking and looked directly at me. "Captain, help me understand the timeline here. You had visual contact with Marcus underwater, you knew he was still alive and fighting, and you made the decision to cut the anchor chain that was connected to the gear holding him. Is that correct?" The question was phrased clinically, without judgment, but it cut to the heart of what I'd have to live with for the rest of my life. I'd cut that chain knowing Marcus was still alive, still hoping to be rescued. "That's correct. Were there any other options you considered? Any way to save both Marcus and your vessel?" I'd asked myself this question 100 times since making the cut. Our emergency diving equipment was inadequate for an 80-foot rescue. The Coast Guard was hours away. Marcus had been underwater for 3 minutes in 40-degree water. Even if we'd had professional diving gear and a trauma team standing by, hypothermia and pressure would have killed him long before we could attempt a rescue. "But you don't know that for certain," Lieutenant Chen pressed. "You don't know that Marcus couldn't have survived if you'd taken different action." "No," I admitted. "I don't know that for certain. What I knew for certain was that if I didn't cut that chain, I'd lose 6 men instead of 1. Lieutenant Chen made more notes, then closed her folder. "Captain, I'm going to need you to submit a written statement detailing everything we've discussed. I'm also going to need statements from each of your crew members." As the Coast Guard team finished their investigation and prepared to return to their cutter, Tommy appeared at my side. "How'd it go?" "Hard to tell," I replied. "She's good at her job, asked all the right questions. Wants written statements from everyone." "What do you think they'll conclude?" I looked out at the water where Marcus had died, where my decision had saved my crew and condemned him to death in the darkness below. I think they'll conclude that I made the only choice available under the circumstances. Whether that makes it the right choice is something else entirely. The Coast Guard cutter Forward departed our position after transferring the investigative team back aboard, leaving the Relentless alone with the disturbed water and the knowledge of what had happened there. Lieutenant Chin had given me her card and instructions for submitting our written statements, but she'd offered no indication of what conclusions the investigation might reach. "Jimmy," Frank Morrison said as we watched the Coast Guard vessel disappear over the horizon. "You want to head for port? We can be back in Gloucester by tomorrow morning." It was a reasonable suggestion. Our hold was full of scallops, our immediate emergency was over, and staying on the fishing grounds where Marcus had died served no practical purpose. But something about leaving felt like abandonment, like we were turning our backs on the place where our shipmate had lost his life. "Give me a few more minutes," I said. I walked to the rail where Marcus had gone over the side, looking down at water that showed no sign of the tragedy that had occurred there. In a few hours, the current and waves would have erased even the slightest trace of our emergency. The ocean would go back to being just another fishing ground, marked only by GPS coordinates that would haunt my memory. Bobby Chin joined me at the rail, his young face still showing the shock of watching a man die. "Captain, could we have saved him? If we tried something different, been faster with the rescue gear?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe if the cable had parted differently, if he hadn't gotten tangled, if we'd been closer to shore. But with the way it happened, with how fast he went down and how cold the water was, I don't think so." "Then why does it feel like we let him down?" It was a good question from a young fisherman who was learning that our work could demand impossible choices. Because that's what it means to survive when someone else doesn't. Even when there's nothing you could have done differently, even when you made the only choice available, you still have to live with the fact that you're here and they're not. Dave Morrison had been listening to our conversation. "My dad always said the ocean doesn't care about fair. It just takes what it wants and leaves the rest of us to figure out why." We stood in silence for several more minutes, 3 generations of fishermen trying to process a tragedy that would reshape how we understood our work and each other. The practical part of my brain knew that accidents like this were an accepted risk of commercial fishing, that the statistical probability of equipment failure and crew fatalities was built into our insurance rates and safety regulations. But the human part of my brain couldn't stop replaying those moments when I'd held the bolt cutters, knowing that one squeeze would save my crew and abandon Marcus to his fate. "All right," I said finally. "Let's head for home. Set course for Gloucester, full speed. I want to be tied up at the dock by 0800 tomorrow." As the Relentless turned toward shore and began the long steam home, I realized that the hardest part of this ordeal wasn't behind us. It was just beginning. The Coast Guard investigation would determine the legal ramifications of Marcus's death, but I still had to face his family, my community, and my own conscience. The 8-hour run back to Gloucester gave us time to process what had happened, but it also gave us time to second-guess every decision made during those crucial minutes. Tommy spent most of the trip in the engine room, checking and rechecking systems that had worked perfectly during the emergency. The Morrison brothers cleaned and maintained equipment that didn't need cleaning or maintenance. Bobby monitored radio frequencies with unusual intensity, as if staying busy could somehow undo what we'd all witnessed. But no amount of busy work could change the fact that we were returning to port with 5 crew members instead of 6. Around midnight, as we passed the Stellwagen Bank light, I finally made the phone call I'd been dreading. Marcus's emergency contact information listed his mother, Dorothy Washington, in New Bedford. The call had to come from me as captain, before she heard about her son's death from the Coast Guard or the media. "Mrs. Washington, this is Captain James Sullivan of the fishing vessel Relentless. I'm calling about your son Marcus." The silence that followed my introduction told me she already knew why I was calling. In fishing families, late-night calls from boat captains never carry good news. "He's gone, isn't he?" she said finally, her voice steady but hollow. "Yes, ma'am. There was an accident with our winch equipment. Marcus was pulled overboard and we weren't able to save him. I'm very sorry for your loss." What followed was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. Dorothy Washington asked questions that I answered as honestly as I could. What had happened, how long Marcus had been in the water, whether he had suffered. She didn't ask about the decision to cut the anchor chain, didn't question whether we'd done everything possible to save her son. Instead, she asked about Marcus's final weeks aboard the Relentless, whether he'd been happy with the work, whether he'd been accepted by the crew. She wanted to know that her son had found his place among us before he died. Marcus was a good fisherman and a good shipmate, I told her. He was learning the work, earning the crew's respect. He died doing honest work with men who considered him family. It wasn't a lie, but it felt inadequate given the magnitude of her loss. How do you explain to a mother that her son died because equipment failed at exactly the wrong moment, because the ocean had claimed another life despite all our safety precautions and experience? "Captain Sullivan," she said before ending the call, "I want you to know that Marcus talked about you and your crew every time he called home. He said you ran a good boat, that he felt safe working for you. Whatever happened out there, I know you did everything you could." Her words hit harder than any accusation could have. Dorothy Washington was absolving me of responsibility for her son's death, expressing faith in decisions I wasn't sure I could defend even to myself. We tied up at the Gloucester Fish Pier at 0743 hours, 15 minutes ahead of my estimated arrival time. Word of Marcus's death had already spread through the fishing community. The harbor master met us at the dock with condolences and information about when the scallops could be offloaded and sold. "Sorry for your loss, Jimmy," Harbor Master Pete Kowalski said as my crew secured our dock lines. "Hell of a thing to happen on what should have been a good trip." The business of commercial fishing continued around Marcus's death with a practicality that felt both heartless and necessary. Our scallops still needed to be processed and sold, our gear needed to be repaired and maintained, our boat needed to be prepared for the next trip. The ocean and the market waited for no one, not even to mourn the dead. But as my crew began the process of offloading our catch, I noticed the subtle changes that Marcus's death had created. Tommy worked with unusual silence, focused on mechanical tasks rather than the easy conversation that normally accompanied our dock work. The Morrison brothers moved efficiently but without their usual banter. Bobby helped with the unloading but kept glancing toward the harbor entrance, as if expecting Marcus to appear with some explanation for his absence. The reality of losing a crew member was settling over all of us like fog, present but intangible, changing how we saw familiar tasks and spaces. "Captain Sullivan?" A young woman with a notebook and camera approached our boat as we finished securing for the day. "I'm Sarah Martinez from the Gloucester Times. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about the accident." Media attention was something I'd anticipated but hoped to avoid. Marcus's death would be news in a community where fishing accidents affected everyone, where the loss of one fisherman reminded all the others of their own mortality. "Not much to say that won't be in the Coast Guard report," I replied. "Good man, tragic accident, our thoughts are with his family. Can you tell me about the decision to cut your anchor chain? Some people are saying you abandoned a rescue effort to save your boat." The question hit like a physical blow. Somewhere in the 8 hours since the accident, the story had already been simplified into a narrative that made me look like a captain who'd chosen property over human life. The complexity of the situation, the impossible timing, the certainty that Marcus was already beyond rescue, none of that would fit in a newspaper headline. "Young lady, I made a decision that saved 5 lives, I said carefully. "If I'd made a different decision, we'd have lost 6 men instead of 1. That's not abandoning a rescue, that's preventing a greater tragedy." But even as I said these words, I could see how they would be interpreted by people who hadn't been there, who couldn't understand the split-second nature of the choice I'd faced. The newspaper story would reduce a complex emergency to a simple moral question. Should a captain sacrifice crew members to save his boat? Sarah Martinez pressed for more details, but I ended the interview and walked toward my truck. The fishing community would judge my actions based on their own experience with emergency decisions at sea. The general public would judge based on newspaper stories that couldn't possibly convey the reality of what had happened 60 miles offshore. That evening, I drove to New Bedford to attend the wake that Dorothy Washington had organized for her son. The funeral home was filled with people from Marcus's neighborhood, his previous jobs, his family's church. I was one of only a few white faces in a predominantly black gathering, one of the few people there who had actually known Marcus as a fisherman rather than as a son, brother, or neighbor. Dorothy Washington embraced me when I approached the casket, thanking me again for the job opportunity I'd given Marcus and for calling her personally with news of his death. Her grief was evident but controlled, shaped by a strength that reminded me of the ocean itself, vast, deep, and more powerful than anything that tried to contain it. "He was so proud to be working on a real fishing boat," she told me. "Said it was the best job he'd ever had, that he was finally making enough money to take care of his family properly." Marcus's sisters, Keisha and Tamara, were there with their children, nieces and nephews who would grow up never knowing the uncle who had died trying to provide for their future. The financial pressure that had driven Marcus to take a dangerous job offshore would continue affecting his family for years to come. As I stood beside the casket, looking at Marcus in his dress uniform from his brief stint in the Coast Guard, I was struck by how young he looked. 28 years old, with decades of life ahead of him that would never be lived because equipment had failed at exactly the wrong moment. Captain Sullivan, a man in his 60s, approached me during the viewing. I'm Marcus's grandfather, Robert Washington. I worked fishing boats out of New Bedford for 37 years before I retired. He had the hands and weathered face of a career fisherman, someone who understood the work that had killed his grandson. Marcus talked about you when he came to visit, Robert continued. Said you ran a tight ship, treated your crew fair. I want you to know that what happened out there, that wasn't your fault. Equipment fails, sea takes good men sometimes. That's the risk we all accept when we choose this work. His absolution meant more than any official investigation could. Robert Washington had worked the same waters, faced the same dangers, made the same kinds of split-second decisions that defined commercial fishing. If anyone could judge whether I'd acted appropriately, it was a man who'd survived 37 years of similar choices. But as I drove back to Gloucester that night, I realized that external forgiveness, from Marcus's family, from experienced fishermen, from Coast Guard investigators, couldn't address the internal question that would follow me for the rest of my career. In those crucial seconds when I'd held the bolt cutters, had I really made the only possible choice? Or had I chosen the option that saved my boat and my crew at the expense of a man who might still have been saved? The official investigation would conclude that my actions were reasonable under the circumstances. The fishing community would support my decision as the kind of tragic but necessary choice that captains sometimes had to make. Marcus's family would continue to express gratitude for the job opportunity I'd given him and the respect with which I'd treated his memory. But none of that would silence the voice in my head that whispered, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, that maybe I'd cut that chain too quickly. Maybe I'd been too ready to sacrifice one man to save five. Maybe a different captain, a better captain, would have found another way. The hardest part wasn't living with the decision I'd made. The hardest part was living with the uncertainty about whether it had been the right decision at all.